The last thing my mother said before I left that Thanksgiving table was, "Naomi, your grandfather trusted us to protect you from yourself." She said it in front of 11 people. My aunt, my uncle, Brandon smiling into his wine glass, the family lawyer, who had driven up from Westport just for the occasion. What none of them knew was that 3 weeks earlier, I had been assigned to examine the private bank holding my trust. I didn't audit corporations. I audited banks for the Federal Reserve. And what I had already found in Harwick's records would not stay quiet much longer. Before I continue, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. And hit like and subscribe if you've ever been told by your own family that you weren't ready, when you were the most prepared person in the room. I grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut, which sounds like a privilege until you understand what it actually means to be the wrong child in the right zip code. Our house on Field Point Road had 6 bedrooms, a circular driveway, and a gardener named Paul who came every Thursday. From the outside, we were the Turners, Richard and Diane, their son Brandon, their daughter Naomi. A clean, photogenic family. The kind you see in the background of a Ralph Lauren ad without really noticing. What you would not have noticed unless you lived inside it was the architecture of how love was distributed in that house. Brandon was 22 months older than me. That gap, in my mother's accounting, was everything. He was the firstborn, the heir apparent, the one my father took to Giants games, and my mother defended in every argument before he even finished speaking. Brandon did not need to earn things in our family. Things simply arrived for him. Opportunities, patience, second chances, money. They arrived the way weather arrives. Nobody questioned it. I was the one who questioned it. That, I think, is where the trouble began. I left Greenwich at 18 on a full scholarship to the University of Pennsylvania. My parents came to the drop-off, helped me carry boxes, took a photo in front of the dormitory. My mother cried. It looked, from the outside, like a normal send-off. What she said to me the night before, alone in the kitchen, was this: "Don't embarrass us by struggling, Naomi. If you need help, call. But try not to need help." I did not call. I graduated in 3 years with a degree in economics and a minor in applied mathematics. I passed the CPA exam on my first attempt at 21. By 23, I was at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, starting as a junior examiner in the supervision division. By 27, I was leading examination teams into mid-sized private banks across the Northeast. By 32, which is where this story begins, I was a senior bank examiner with federal credentials, statutory authority, and a caseload that involved institutions holding a combined $40 billion in assets. I wore the same black blazer to every examination. I kept my credentials in a slim leather holder in the left inside pocket of my bag. I had testified before the Senate Banking Committee twice. I had referred 11 institutions to the Department of Justice in 9 years. My parents thought I worked in finance. Somewhere in an office. Something with numbers, my mother told people at the country club. She was not wrong. She was also not close. I never corrected her. This is the part people find strange when I explain it later. Why didn't you just tell them? The answer is that I tried once, early on. I was 24. I had just completed my first solo field examination, and I was proud in the quiet, solid way that comes from doing something genuinely hard. I told my father over dinner during Christmas. I explained what a Fed examiner does. I explained the authority, the process, the weight of it. He listened, then he said, "Brandon is thinking about getting his real estate license. That's a smart move in this market." I put down my fork. I picked it back up. I finished my dinner. After that, I let them believe what they wanted to believe. It was easier. And if I am honest with myself, there was a small, cold part of me that understood, even then, that the gap between what they thought I was and what I actually was might one day matter. I did not know how much it would matter. Not yet. My grandfather, my mother's father, Gerald Whitmore, died when I was 26. He was a careful man, a self-made man, which in Connecticut means something specific. He had built real wealth without inheriting it, which made him unusual in the circles my mother kept. He had also, unlike almost everyone else in my family, paid attention to me. He came to my Penn graduation. He was the only family member who did. He sat in the bleachers in a blue linen jacket, and he clapped when they called my name. And afterward, he took me to dinner alone, without my parents, and he ordered a bottle of wine and said, "You're going to be the one. Naomi, I want you to know I see that." 2 years later, he was gone. Pancreatic cancer, 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end. He left behind a trust fund, $2.4 million, structured specifically for me, established at Harwick Private Bank in Greenwich. It was supposed to become fully accessible to me at 30. I was 28 when he died. 2 years to wait, my parents informed me of the trust's existence at the reading of his will. My mother held my hand when the lawyer read the relevant section. She squeezed it. She said, "Dad always loved you so much." She was crying. I remember thinking her grief looked genuine. I believed it was. What I did not know at 28 was that within 6 months of Gerald Whitmore's death, my parents had obtained a document, later confirmed to be fraudulent, granting them extended fiduciary authority over the trust until I turned 35. Not 30. 35. 7 more years of control. I did not know about the $880, zero that had been withdrawn in increments carefully sized to avoid federal reporting thresholds. I did not know that $340,000 of that had purchased Brandon's apartment on the Upper West Side. I did not know about the renovation of my parents' Nantucket house, the 2 vehicles, the private school tuition for Brandon's son, from a relationship none of us were supposed to discuss. I did not know any of that yet. What I knew, turning 32 that October, was that my grandfather had left me $2. 4 million, and I had not received a cent of it. When I asked, my mother said the trust was still in a structured growth phase. When I asked again, my father said the market had been volatile and they were protecting my principal. When I hired a private attorney to make inquiries, Harwick Bank said the account was under active fiduciary management and declined to release records to a third party without authorization from the named trustees. The named trustees were Richard and Diane Turner. I sat with that for 2 weeks. I looked at the bank's name on the letter my attorney had forwarded. Harwick Private Bank, Greenwich, Connecticut. I opened my laptop. I pulled up the Fed's examination schedule for the first quarter. Harwick Private Bank was on it. Assigned examiner, me. I closed the laptop. I went to bed. I slept, for the first time in weeks, without any trouble at all. The Greenwich Country Club hosts its annual Heritage Gala every second Saturday of November. It is not the kind of event you attend because you want to. It is the kind of event you attend because your mother has already told 3 people you are coming. And the alternative, the explanation, the negotiation, the guilt distributed in careful portions over the following weeks, costs more than the evening itself. I had learned this calculation early. I went most years. I wore the same navy dress. I stayed 2 hours. I left. That November, I almost did not go. I was 4 weeks from the start of the Harwick examination. I had a preliminary document request sitting in draft on my work laptop. I had spent the previous weekend reviewing trust law case files from 3 similar fraud investigations in other districts. I was not, in any internal sense, available for a gala, but my mother had called twice and texted once, and the text said, "Brandon has an announcement. It would mean a lot if you were there, Naomi," so I went. The club smelled the way it always smelled: old wood, cut flowers, and something expensive being served in small portions. The main room had been arranged with round tables and low centerpieces, cream and gold, the kind of event design that signals money without appearing to try. There were perhaps 140 people. I recognized most of them. They were the families I had grown up adjacent to, not quite inside of, never fully inside of: the Harringtons, the Delacroix Bennetts, the Caldwells, who owned 3 car dealerships and donated a building to the hospital. My mother found me within 4 minutes of my arrival. She was in burgundy, her hair done, her smile at the precise wattage appropriate for a room like this. Warm enough to be genuine, controlled enough not to crease, she kissed my cheek. She smelled like Chanel No. 5, which she had worn since I was small. "You look thin," she said, which was her version of a greeting. "You look beautiful," I said, which was mine. My father was at the bar with 2 men I recognized from the club's board. He raised his glass when he saw me. A minimal acknowledgement, but an acknowledgement. I raised mine back. Brandon arrived 20 minutes later with his girlfriend, Kelsey, who was 26 and had the particular confidence of someone who has never been told no in a way that stuck. She wore red. She hugged my mother for a long time. She called my father Rick, which no one else called him, and he laughed when she did it. We sat. The dinner was salmon, or filet. I had the salmon. Brandon had the filet and ordered a second glass of Bordeaux before the first course was cleared. It was during the main course that my mother stood. She did not tap her glass. She simply stood, and the table quieted, and then the tables nearby quieted, in that ripple effect that happens when someone with sufficient social authority decides a moment has arrived. "I just want to take a moment," she said, "to share something we're very proud of as a family." I set down my fork. Brandon has made a significant investment this year, a property acquisition in Manhattan that reflects the kind of vision and financial maturity that Richard and I always knew he had in him. She paused. She smiled at him. He smiled back. Kelsey put her hand on his arm. We're so proud of the man he's become. And we're grateful we could play a small part in helping him get there. The table applauded. The nearby tables applauded. My father reached over and gripped Brandon's shoulder. I knew, in the specific way that you know something when the math has already been done, and you are simply watching the numbers walk into the room, exactly where that investment had come from. $340,000. Brandon's Upper West Side apartment, the one purchased 14 months after my grandfather died. I did not make a sound. I picked up my fork. I finished my salmon. It was well prepared. The capers were good. After dinner, while Kelsey was showing photographs of the apartment to my aunt, my father appeared at my elbow. He steered me gently, but with purpose toward the edge of the room, near the tall windows that looked out onto the darkened terrace. The gesture was practiced. He had been moving people to the edge of rooms his entire life. He stood close. He spoke quietly, which in my father's vocabulary means the conversation is serious and not for repetition. I know you've had questions about the trust, he said. Your attorney reaching out to Harwick created some unnecessary friction. I looked at him. Your grandfather trusted us to manage this properly, he continued. He knew you, he loved you, but he also knew you were young and building your career, and that the timing needed to be right. We're protecting your principal, Naomi. That's what trustees do. I let him finish. The room moved behind him, glasses lifted, laughter surfacing and receding, a small orchestra beginning something quiet in the corner. Your grandfather trusted us to protect you from yourself, he said. We take that seriously. I nodded once. Okay, I said. That was all I said. I retrieved my coat from the attendant at 10:15. I said goodbye to my mother, who held my hands briefly and told me to get more sleep. I said goodbye to Brandon, who was deep in a conversation about the apartment's ceiling height. I did not look back when I walked out. The valet brought my car around. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine. The formal examination of Harwick Private Bank was scheduled to begin in 26 days. I started the car. I drove back to the city. I did not cry. I did not turn on the radio. I simply drove and thought, and by the time I crossed the Triborough Bridge, the outline of what was going to happen was already clear and complete in my mind, the way a balance sheet is clear when every line has been correctly entered and the totals at the bottom cannot be argued with. I have a rule about professional decisions. Never make them while angry, not because anger is wrong. Anger, in my experience, is frequently the most accurate emotional response available. It is a precise instrument when the situation calls for precision. But anger also has a half-life, and decisions made at its peak tend to carry its shape, reactive, visible, traceable back to a feeling rather than a fact. In my work, feelings do not hold up in federal court. Facts do, so I went home to my apartment in Morningside Heights, made a pot of coffee I did not drink, and sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. I wrote down what I knew. I wrote down what I suspected. I drew a line between the two columns, and I did not allow anything to cross it without evidence. What I knew: my grandfather had established a trust of $2.4 million in my name at Harwick Private Bank. The trust was supposed to become fully accessible at 30. I was 32. I had not received a cent. My parents had represented to me, verbally and through an attorney, that extended fiduciary authority had been legitimately granted to them and that the trust remained intact. What I suspected: the document granting that extended authority was fraudulent. The trust was not intact. The next morning I called my attorney, a woman named Patricia O.C., who practiced trusts and estates out of a firm in Midtown. I had hired her 6 weeks earlier after the second conversation with my father, in which his answers about the trust had shifted slightly. Not dramatically, just slightly. The way a story shifts when the person telling it is managing multiple versions simultaneously. Patricia had made the inquiry to Harwick that my father described as creating unnecessary friction. She had received the refusal. I told her what I was about to tell her could not leave the conversation. She said she understood. I told her I was the lead examiner on the Federal Reserve's upcoming examination of Harwick Private Bank. There was a pause. Naomi, she said carefully, you understand what you're describing. I do, I said. I need you to preserve every document you've collected to this point. Do not make any further contact with Harwick or with my parents. Do not send any correspondence. Do not file anything. Just hold. For how long? 25 days, I said. She held. What I did not tell Patricia, what I did not tell anyone, was the specific thing I had noticed 3 days earlier while conducting a preliminary review of Harwick's publicly available regulatory filings in preparation for the examination. It was not a red flag precisely. A red flag implies something obvious, something that announces itself. This was more like a small inconsistency in a footnote on a form that most examiners would have moved past without pausing. I paused. Harwick had reported a modest decrease in fiduciary assets under management over the preceding fiscal year. The decrease was within normal range. It would not have drawn attention from anyone who was not already looking. But I was already looking, and the category of accounts that had decreased was specific. Discretionary trust accounts established prior to 2018, with individual asset values between $1 and $5 million. My grandfather had established my trust in 2016. Its value at establishment was $2.4 million. I wrote that down in the left column. I drew a small circle around it. The days between the gala and the start of the examination had a particular quality I remember clearly, a kind of enforced stillness that required constant maintenance. I went to work. I prepared my examination plan. I reviewed Harwick's prior examination reports, which showed a clean institution, well managed, no significant findings in the previous 3 cycles. A small private bank serving wealthy clients in Fairfield County. Exactly the kind of institution where irregularities could persist for years without detection because nobody expected to find them, and the clients were not the kind of people who filed complaints. My parents called twice during those weeks. My mother, on a Tuesday evening, to ask whether I would be coming home for Christmas. I said I was not sure. She said that was disappointing. I said I was sorry to disappoint her. She said, in the particular tone she used when she wanted to indicate a conversation was beneath her, "We're only trying to look after you, Naomi. That's all we've ever done." I said I knew. I said goodnight. I set the phone face down on the counter. My father sent a text 4 days before the examination was scheduled to begin. It said, "Naomi, the trust account is due for an annual review. Our attorney will be reaching out to you regarding some routine documentation. Please be cooperative. This is in your interest." I read it twice. Routine documentation. I thought about the word routine, how it is used sometimes as a kind of sedative. Routine means, don't look closely. Routine means, just sign. I did not respond. The night before I drove to Greenwich to begin the examination, I sat at my kitchen table again with the legal pad. I looked at the 2 columns, what I knew, what I suspected. The suspected column had grown. The known column had not yet caught up. That was about to change. I had examined 41 institutions in 9 years. I had walked into banks in 4 states carrying nothing but a credentials case and a document request list and statutory authority that superseded anything a bank's general counsel wanted to argue about. I had found things people had spent years concealing. I had found things people did not know were findable. What I had never done in 9 years was walk into an examination knowing that somewhere in that institution's records was a file with my own name on it. I closed the legal pad. I set my credentials case by the door. I went to bed. I thought about my grandfather, the blue linen jacket at my graduation. "You're going to be the one, Naomi." I had always taken that as encouragement. Sitting there in the dark, I wondered if he had meant something more specific. If he had seen, even then, what kind of family he was leaving me inside of, and had tried, in the only way available to him, to make sure I had something that could not be taken. He had not anticipated how creatively it could be managed, but then again, neither had they anticipated me. Federal bank examinations do not announce themselves with drama. There is no raid, no flashing lights, no moment where someone in a dark jacket holds up a badge at the front entrance while cameras roll. What happens is considerably quieter and, in my experience, considerably more effective for being quiet. A letter goes out 30 days in advance, formal, precise, listing the documents to be made available on the first day of examination. On the morning of day 1, the examination team arrives, presents credentials to the institution's compliance officer, is escorted to a designated work area, usually a conference room with adequate table space and a network connection, and begins. The work area Harwick assigned us was on the 2nd floor. A long room with windows facing the parking lot and a credenza along one wall that someone had stocked with coffee, bottled water, and a bowl of wrapped mints that nobody touched. There were 3 of us, myself, a junior examiner named Curtis, who had been with me on 4 prior engagements, and a data analyst named Vera who had joined the division 8 months earlier and was, in my assessment, going to be excellent. The compliance officer at Harwick was a man named Gerald Fitch, late 50s, careful, the kind of compliance officer who has spent his career trying to be invisibly competent. He shook my hand at the door, showed us upstairs, asked twice whether the room was adequate. I told him it was. He left a direct extension on a notocard by the phone and closed the door behind him. I set my bag down. I opened my credentials case on the table, not because I needed to look at it, but because I have a habit of placing it where I can see it. Curtis began setting up the laptop connections. Vera opened the preliminary document index we had prepared. Standard sequencing? Curtis asked. Standard sequencing, I said. Pull the fiduciary book first. In a bank examination, the fiduciary book is the complete record of all trust accounts under the institution's administration. Account holders, establishing documents, asset values, transaction histories, authorization records. It is usually the third or fourth item in a standard examination sequence. I had moved it to first. Curtis did not ask why. He had worked with me long enough to know I moved things for reasons. Fitch delivered the fiduciary book at 9:40. It was a bound document, physical, supplemented by a digital file on an encrypted drive, standard for an institution of Harwick's size. I signed the receipt. I set the physical binder aside. I opened the digital file. There are 847 trust accounts administered by Harwick Private Bank. I was not looking for all of them. I was looking for one, and I found it on page 31 of the digital index, listed under account number HT 2020-0394, established October 14, 2016, beneficiary. Turner, Naomi E. I did not react. I had spent 9 years training myself not to react to things I found in examination rooms. Reaction belongs outside the room. Inside the room there is only the document and what it says. I opened the account file. The original trust instrument was there. 12 pages, my grandfather's signature on the final page, notarized October 14, 2016, at an office in Stamford. I read it carefully. It was clean. It said what Patricia had told me it should say. Full beneficial access to Naomi E. Turner upon reaching age 30, with no provisions for extended fiduciary oversight beyond the standard administrative period. Then I found the amendment. It was dated March 3, 2017, 4 months after my grandfather's death. 3 pages. It extended fiduciary authority over the trust to Richard A. Turner and Diane M. Turner until the beneficiary reached age 35. It bore a notary stamp from an office in Greenwich. It bore, on the signature line designated for the trust's original grantor, a signature reading Gerald T. Whitmore. My grandfather had been dead for 4 months when that document was signed. I read the date again. I read the signature again. I set the document down on the table, and I looked out the window at the parking lot for approximately 4 seconds. Then I picked it up again. Vera, I said, I need a certified copy request, prepared for account HT 20-0394, full transaction history, all authorization records, all correspondence on file, and all amendment documents with associated notarization records. Got it, she said, without looking up. Curtis, I said, I need you to cross-reference this account number against the wire transfer logs for the period January 2017 through present. He looked at me then. Just briefly. He had seen me work for 4 years, and he knew what that combination of requests meant. How far back on the wires? He asked. All of it, I said. It took until 2 in the afternoon. By 2 o'clock I had in front of me a transaction history spanning 7 years and 3 months, comprising 41 separate withdrawals from my trust account totaling $887,400. Each withdrawal had been authorized under the fraudulent amendment. Each authorization bore a signature, sometimes my father's, sometimes my mother's. Once a signature, I did not immediately recognize that later resolved to the family's attorney, a man named Howard Briggs, who had been practicing trusts and estates in Westport for 30 years. The withdrawals were sized with care. The largest single transaction was $48,500, just below the threshold that triggers automatic federal reporting. The pattern was deliberate. Whoever had structured it had known exactly where the lines were drawn. I had spent 9 years learning where those lines were drawn. I had also spent 9 years learning what it looks like when someone thinks they are safely beneath them. I photographed each page with my work device. I completed the certified copy request. I initialed the chain of custody forms. I worked through the rest of the afternoon on the standard examination components: capital adequacy, credit quality, management assessment, with the same attention I gave every institution. At 5:15, When Curtis and Vera had packed up for the evening, I sat alone in the conference room for 6 minutes. The parking lot outside had mostly emptied. The mints on the credenza were still untouched. I thought about my grandfather's signature on the amendment, the careful, deliberate forgery of a dead man's name on a document designed to take money from his granddaughter. I thought about the 41 withdrawals. I thought about Brandon at the gala, smiling into his wine glass while my mother announced his Manhattan investment. I thought about my father's hand on my elbow, steering me to the edge of the room. We're protecting your principal, Naomi. That's what trustees do. I picked up my phone. I did not call my parents. I did not call Patricia. I called the Financial Crimes Unit of the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. I had worked with them twice before. The attorney who answered was a woman named Sandra Cho. And when I told her my name, she said Naomi. "What have you got? A 7-year trust fraud," I said. "Forged grantor signature on a fiduciary amendment, 41 structured withdrawals totaling $887,000, and a complete transaction record in federal custody as of today." There was a brief silence. "Institution?" she said. "Harwick Private Bank, Greenwich." "I'm the assigned examiner." Another silence. Shorter. "Send me the certified copies when they're ready," she said. "I'll open a file tonight." I said I would. I thanked her. I ended the call. I put on my coat. I picked up my bag. I turned off the conference room light. Outside, the evening was cold and clear, the way November evenings in Connecticut can be. The sky a deep, specific blue that exists only for an hour after sunset. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a moment before starting the engine. 41 withdrawals, 7 years. A dead man's name on a document signed 4 months after he died. My grandfather had left me $2.4 million and told me I was going to be the one. He was right. He just did not know what it was going to look like. The call from my mother came on a Thursday morning, 17 days after I began the Harwick examination. I was at my desk in the Fed's Manhattan office, reviewing a separate set of filings, when her name appeared on my phone screen. I let it ring twice. I picked up on the third. "Naomi," she said. Her voice had the particular texture it gets when she has prepared what she is going to say, smooth on the surface with something compressed underneath. "I need you to do something for us, and I need you to do it this week." I said nothing. I waited. Howard is preparing a routine extension document for the trust account. It's an administrative matter, the kind of thing that has to be renewed periodically to maintain continuity of management. He needs your signature to complete the filing. I watched a pigeon land on the ledge outside my office window. It stood there for a moment, considered the situation, and left. "What kind of extension?" I said. "Naomi, it's paperwork. Howard has explained it all in a letter he's sending to your apartment this week. It just needs your signature and a notarization." "There's nothing complicated about it, Mom," I said. "I'd like to understand what I'm signing before I sign it." A pause. "Brief, but present, of course," she said. "That's reasonable. Read Howard's letter. But please don't delay on this. There are filing deadlines involved, and we don't want any complications." I told her I would look for the letter. I said goodbye. I set the phone down. I thought about the word complications. In my professional life, complications is what institutions say when they mean, "We have been doing something we would prefer to continue doing without interference." I had heard it across friends' tables, from compliance officers, general counsels, senior vice presidents. It always meant the same thing. Howard Briggs's letter arrived the following Monday. It was 3 pages, single-spaced, dense, with the particular language that trusts and estates attorneys deploy when they want something to appear more routine than it is. The core of it, stripped of the language, was this. My parents were requesting that I sign a document extending their fiduciary authority over the trust for an additional 5 years, until I turned 37, citing ongoing market volatility and the need for continued professional management of the assets. There was a signature block on the 3rd page, with my name already typed beneath it. I forwarded the letter to Patricia. I forwarded a copy to Sandra Cho at the U.S. Attorney's Office. I did not respond to Howard Briggs. 4 days after the letter arrived, my father texted, "Naomi, your mother tells me you received Howard's letter. We need this handled quickly. Please don't make this difficult. This is in your interest and you know it." I read it. I put the phone in my bag. I went back to work. The second escalation came from Brandon, which surprised me slightly, not because he was incapable of it, but because Brandon had historically preferred to let our parents conduct the family's uncomfortable conversations while he remained in the background. Pleasant, and expensive and uninvolved. That he appeared at my apartment on a Wednesday evening told me the pressure inside the family had reached a level where they needed another instrument. He knocked at 7:15. I had just gotten home. I was still in my work clothes, the black blazer, a gray blouse, and I had a glass of water in my hand when I opened the door and found him standing in the hallway, looking the way Brandon always looked. Easy, well-dressed, faintly amused by the circumstances of his own life. "Hey," he said. "Can I come in?" I stepped back. He came in. He looked around my apartment the way he always did, not critically, exactly, but with the mild curiosity of someone taking inventory of a space that is smaller than the ones he inhabits. I did not offer him anything. I leaned against the kitchen counter. "Mom and Dad are stressed," he said. "About the document, I know," I said. "It's really not a big deal, Naomi. It's just paperwork. Then why is everyone so stressed about it?" He smiled. It was a good smile. Brandon had always had a good smile, the kind that made people want to be on his side of things without quite knowing why. "Because you're being difficult about it. Which is kind of your thing." I looked at him. I thought about the $340 Zuozan that had purchased his apartment. I thought about the ceiling height he had been describing at the gala. I thought about 17 months of his life, the furniture, the location, the view, funded entirely by money my grandfather had left for me. "Brandon," I said, "what do you know about the trust? I know Mom and Dad manage it. I know Grandpa left it to you. That's about it. Do you know how much is in it?" He shifted his weight slightly. "That's really between you and them, it is," I said. "You're right." He stayed for another 10 minutes, circling the same territory with different words. The document was routine. Our parents were getting older, and this kind of management was stressful for them. Wouldn't it be easier to just cooperate? At one point he said, "Look, I know you and Mom have your thing, but this is family. At the end of the day, we look out for each other." I thought, do you know what looking out for each other actually costs? I did not say that. I walked him to the door. I said I would think about it. He left looking mildly satisfied, which was the look he carried into most situations, regardless of how they had actually gone. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway of my apartment for a moment. Here is what I want to ask anyone watching this, because I have thought about it many times since. At what point does a family stop being a family and become something else? Is it the first lie? The first document with a forged signature? Or is it earlier? Is it the moment the architecture gets built? The moment someone decides, quietly and without announcement, that one child is worth more than the other, and everything that follows is just the structure of that decision playing out? I do not have a clean answer. I have thought about it long enough to stop expecting one. What I had, instead of an answer, was a federal case file that was growing more complete by the day. Sandra Cho had called the previous week to tell me her office had opened a formal investigation. She had assigned 2 additional attorneys to the matter. She had also, quietly, contacted the notary, whose stamp appeared on the fraudulent amendment, a woman who worked out of a small office in Greenwich, and who, when presented with the document in question, stated that she had no record of notarizing it, and that the stamp bore her registration number but not her signature. The stamp had been copied. The signature had been fabricated. When I hung up with Sandra that evening, I sat with that for a long time. The care involved in it, the planning. Someone, my parents or someone acting for them, had obtained a notary stamp, copied it, fabricated a signature, attached it to a document bearing a dead man's forged name, and filed it with a private bank in Greenwich. And then for 7 years they had made withdrawals against it, careful, measured, sized to stay beneath the thresholds. And they had come to Thanksgiving dinners and galas, and they had held my hand at my grandfather's will reading and told me he had always loved me so much. I had not cried once through this entire process. I want to be clear about that. Not because I think it reflects well on me. Not because I want to appear harder than I am, but because I think it is important to say, some things are too large for tears. Some things require a different kind of response entirely. The response I had was this. I went back to work. I pulled out my legal pad. I looked at the column marked what I know, and I drew a line under it. And everything I had found at Harwick, everything Sandra had confirmed, everything that was now in federal custody. I wrote it all in that column, careful and exact. The suspected column was almost empty now. My mother has a gift for narrative, not fiction, exactly. She would not describe herself as someone who makes things up. What she does is something more refined than that. She selects. She emphasizes. She arranges the available facts into a sequence that produces the impression she requires. And she does it with such consistency and confidence that the people around her often cannot locate the seam between what happened and what she has said happened. I had watched her do this my entire life. I had watched her do it at dinner tables, at country club luncheons, at school meetings when Brandon was struggling, and the story needed to become about a sensitive child in an unsupportive system rather than a boy who had not done the work. I had always understood it as a social skill, useful, mildly troubling, essentially harmless. Now she turned it on me. The first indication came from my Aunt Carol, my mother's younger sister, who called me on a Sunday morning in early December. Carol and I had always been cordial. Not close, but cordial, and her voice on the phone had the careful quality of someone delivering information they are not sure they should be delivering. "I just want you to know," she said, "that I'm not repeating this as fact. But your mother has been telling people, family, some friends, that you've been under a lot of stress, that you've been making accusations about financial matters that aren't," her word, grounded. I asked Carol what specifically my mother had said, "that you've been having some difficulties, emotionally, that the pressure of your job has been affecting your judgment, and that the family is worried about you." I thanked Carol. I told her I appreciated her calling. I told her I was fine. She said she had thought so, and that she was sorry. I set the phone down and I looked at the ceiling for approximately 30 seconds. It was a clean move. I recognized it professionally, the preemptive character attack, deployed before any formal proceeding, designed to establish in the minds of potential witnesses a framework in which the accuser is unstable and the accusation is a symptom rather than a fact. If my parents' attorney had advised this, he had advised it well. If my mother had arrived at it herself, she had arrived at it instinctively, which in some ways was more impressive and in every way was more chilling. My father's contribution was more direct. 3 days after Carol's call, I received a message from a cousin on my father's side, a man named Greg who worked in commercial real estate and whom I saw approximately once a year at family gatherings. His text said, "Hey, heard there's some family stuff going on. Just want to say, your parents are good people, and whatever's happening, I hope you work it out." I did not respond to Greg. The following week, Howard Briggs sent a second letter. This one was shorter. It noted that I had not responded to his previous correspondence and that the filing deadline he had referenced was now 2 weeks away. It expressed, in careful legal language, concern about my ability to act in my own best interest and suggested that if I was experiencing difficulties, my parents as fiduciaries had both the authority and the obligation to act on my behalf. I forwarded it to Sandra and to Patricia. Sandra called me that afternoon. "They're trying to manufacture a record," she said. "If they can establish that you were unresponsive or incapacitated, it potentially gives them grounds to argue any challenge to the trust was untimely." "I know," I said. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I said. "I'm better than fine. What do you need from me?" What she needed was patience, which is the thing federal investigations require more than anything else, and which is also the thing most people find hardest to supply when the matter is personal. The case was being built carefully. Sandra's office was coordinating with the Fed's own legal team, given the dual nature of the matter. A federal examiner whose personal finances were involved in an institution under examination. There were protocols, there were disclosures, there were conversations I was not party to and did not need to be party to, happening in offices I was not in. I continued the Harwick examination. I had disclosed the conflict of interest to my supervisor on day one, and had received guidance on the appropriate boundaries. I could continue leading the examination on all matters unrelated to the Turner Trust account, with a separate examiner reviewing that specific file. In practice, the examination had found enough other material to keep 3 people busy. Harwick was not a corrupt institution exactly, but it was an institution that had allowed a corrupt transaction to persist within it for 7 years without flagging it, which raised questions about its fiduciary oversight practices that were entirely separate from the criminal matter. Fitch, the compliance officer, had become visibly anxious by the 3rd week. He stopped stocking the credenza with mints. He started appearing in the doorway of the conference room at intervals that had no procedural justification, asking whether we needed anything, whether the network connection was adequate, whether we had found everything we needed. I told him each time that we were fine. I told him each time that we would let him know if we required additional materials. We required additional materials on December 14th, when Vera flagged a series of internal emails in Harwick's document production, correspondence between the bank's trust administration department and Howard Briggs's office, spanning 2017 to 2022, in which the details of the fraudulent amendment had been discussed with a specificity that made it clear that at least one senior's employee at Harwick had known. The document was irregular and had chosen to process it regardless. That changed the shape of the case. Sandra's office expanded the investigation. There were now 4 attorneys on it. Through all of this, I continued my ordinary life. I went to work, I went home. I cooked occasionally, simple things, pasta, soup, and ate at my kitchen table, and looked out the window at the street below and thought about nothing in particular with the focused intentionality of someone who knows that thinking about particular things at the wrong moment is a form of leakage they cannot afford. I called my grandmother, my father's mother in her late 70s, living in a retirement community in Sarasota, once a week, as I always had. She asked how I was. I told her I was well. She told me about her garden club, and a book she was reading, and a woman at her building who had gotten a small dog that barked. I listened. It was the most normal part of my week. My parents did not call during December. The silence was its own communication. They were waiting. They believed, because they had spent 32 years having their assessments of me confirmed by outcomes, that I would eventually do what I had always done: accommodate, minimize, find the path that kept the surface smooth. They were building a case, in their way, laying the groundwork, establishing the narrative. I was building something too. In the second week of December, Sandra called to tell me that her office had completed its review of the transaction records and had identified, in addition to the $887,400 withdrawn from my trust, 2 additional instances of what appeared to be fraudulent documentation involving accounts belonging to other Harwick clients. Elderly account holders whose trustees had similarly submitted amendment documents with irregularities. My parents were not connected to those accounts, but the pattern suggested that Harwick's Trust Administration Department had developed, over time, a tolerance for irregular documentation that had enabled multiple frauds, not only one. The scope of the investigation was now considerably larger than my trust account. Sandra told me the U.S. Attorney's Office was planning to move in January. There would be a formal proceeding, a federal examination hearing, the kind that carries subpoena authority. My parents, along with Howard Briggs and 2 Harwick employees, would be required to appear. Where? I asked. Fed Building, Manhattan, she said. Given the examination origin, it makes sense to hold it there. I thought about that. The Fed Building in Manhattan. The building where I had worked for 9 years. The building where I had walked through security hundreds of times with my credentials case in my bag. Naomi, Sandra said. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Go ahead, I said. Are you prepared for what this is going to look like? For your family, I mean. For you. I looked out my kitchen window at the street. It was dark. The streetlights were on. Someone was walking a large dog on the opposite sidewalk, moving at a pace that suggested the dog had chosen the direction. Sandra, I said, I have spent 9 years walking into rooms where people had done things they believed were invisible, and showing them that nothing is invisible. I have done it 41 times. This is the 42nd. A pause. Okay, she said. January 7th. Be there at 9. I wrote it on my calendar. I circled it once, which is more than I usually do. Outside, the person with the dog had disappeared around the corner. The street was quiet. January felt very close, and also, in the way of things you have prepared for, carefully and completely, not frightening at all. The dinner was my mother's idea. She called on December 28th, 3 days after Christmas, which I had spent alone in my apartment with a bottle of good wine and a novel I had been meaning to read for 2 years. It was the first Christmas I had not gone home to Greenwich in 11 years. I had told my mother in November that I had work obligations, which was true, and that I needed the time to rest, which was also true. And she had accepted this with a silence that communicated displeasure without committing to it. Her call on the 28th was warm. That was the first thing I noticed. The warmth was not performed, exactly. My mother is too skilled for performance to be visible. But it had a deliberateness to it, a quality of effort, like a room that has been cleaned specifically because someone is coming. I've been thinking, she said, that we've let things become more complicated than they need to be. Your father agrees. We'd like to have dinner, just family, the 4 of us, nothing formal, and clear the air. Howard will join us briefly to walk through the documents. It will take 20 minutes, and then we can have a real meal together. I thought about this. The request was transparent to me, in the way that a balance sheet with reversed entries is transparent to someone who has read enough of them. The dinner was a closing mechanism. They had deployed the letter, the text messages, the character narrative, the deadline pressure, the brotherly visit, and none of it had produced my signature. The dinner was the final instrument. Get her in a room, surround her with family, have the attorney present with the document, apply the warmth and the pressure simultaneously and in the right ratio and close. It was not a bad strategy. For a different version of me, at a different point in my life, it might have worked. When, I said. New Year's Eve, she said. We'll have champagne. I said I would be there. I called Sandra that afternoon. I told her about the dinner. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Naomi, I need to be clear with you. Do not sign anything. Do not accept, agree to, or verbally commit to anything. You can attend. You should attend. But nothing gets signed. I know, I said, and I need you to understand. January 7th is 8 days away. Whatever happens at that dinner, the proceeding happens regardless. I know that too, I said. What I did not tell Sandra, because it was not her concern, and because I had made the decision independently, and was certain of it, was what I planned to bring to the dinner. Not a signature. Something else entirely. New Year's Eve in Greenwich has a specific atmosphere. The town dressed for the occasion, without appearing to try, the same way my mother dressed for occasions. The houses lit, the roads quiet, the cold with a particular clarity that belongs to that week between Christmas and January. I drove up from the city in the early evening, the highway nearly empty, the sky a dark, clean gray. The house on Field Point Road was lit when I arrived. My mother's car and my father's car in the driveway, and a third car I recognized as Howard Briggs's, a dark green Volvo he had driven for as long as I could remember. Brandon's car was parked slightly crooked near the garage, which was how Brandon parked everywhere, as though the rules of geometry were approximate. I sat in my car for 30 seconds. I checked my bag. I got out. My mother answered the door before I knocked. She had heard the car. She was in black, elegant, her hair done, a glass of white wine already in her hand. She kissed my cheek. She said I looked tired and that she hoped the drive had not been too bad. The house smelled like it always smelled at the holidays. Pine, something roasting, the particular warmth of a large house that has been heated specifically for an occasion. My father came out of the study when he heard my voice. He shook my hand, which he had done since I was approximately 14, the handshake as a register of adult-to-adult interaction, a formality that had always sat slightly wrong. Brandon was in the living room with Kelsey, who smiled at me with the open friendliness of someone who has not been told the full situation. Howard Briggs was at the dining room table, his briefcase open, a single manila folder in front of him. He stood when I came in and extended his hand with the practiced warmth of an attorney who has spent decades in family matters and has learned to lead with reassurance. Naomi, he said, thank you for coming. I think we can make this very straightforward. I'm sure we can, I said. We sat. My mother had prepared lamb. She always made lamb for significant occasions, a choice that had always struck me as deliberate, the kind of meal that signals occasion without announcing it. The table was set for 6. Kelsey had brought flowers. For the first 30 minutes we had dinner. We talked about Christmas, about Kelsey's family in Philadelphia, about a renovation my parents were considering for the Nantucket house. My father asked about my work, vaguely, as he always did, and I said it had been a busy quarter. He nodded. My mother refilled glasses. It was, on its surface, a family dinner, and I want to be honest about this, sitting there, eating my mother's lamb, watching my father cut his meat with the same precise movements he had always made, I felt something I had not anticipated feeling. Not warmth, exactly. Something more complicated than warmth. The recognition of what this was supposed to be, what it might have been, what it would not be. I have thought about that feeling many times since. I have not entirely resolved it. After the main course, my mother cleared the plates. My father poured more wine. Howard opened the manila folder. This is straightforward, he said. A 5-year extension of fiduciary authority, standard language, consistent with your grandfather's intent to ensure the trust is managed with appropriate oversight until, Howard, I said. He stopped. I reached into my bag. I took out a document, not the one he was expecting, not a signed extension, not anything he had prepared. I set it on the table in front of him. I set a copy in front of my father. I set a copy in front of my mother. It was a federal examination order. issued under the authority of the Federal Reserve Act, bearing the case number assigned to the investigation of Harwick Private Bank, bearing on the line designated for the lead examiner's signature, my name, Naomi E. Turner, Senior Bank Examiner, Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The table went quiet, not the polite quiet of a conversation pausing. The specific, total quiet of a room in which every person has simultaneously understood something they cannot ununderstand. My father looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time. His face did not change immediately. He was, like my mother, skilled at not changing. But something around his eyes shifted, a small, involuntary contraction, the physical expression of a calculation going wrong. My mother set down her wine glass. She set it down carefully, with both hands, the way you set something down when your hands are not entirely steady and you do not want anyone to see. Brandon looked at me, then at the document, then at me again. "What is this?" he said. "It's my work," I said. "It's what I do." Howard Briggs had gone very still. He was looking at the case number on the federal examination order, and I watched him recognize it. Watched him understand that the institution named in that order was Harwick, and that the examination that had generated it had access to every document that institution held, including the amendment bearing a dead man's signature and the transaction history of 41 structured withdrawals over 7 years. He closed the manila folder. He did not open it again. "Richard," he said quietly. My father did not respond to Howard. He was still looking at my name on the document. He looked at it the way you look at something when you are trying to find an error in it and cannot find one. "You audit banks," my mother said. Her voice was very quiet. It was the quietest I had ever heard her speak. Not whispering, something more controlled than whispering. "You audit banks for the Federal Reserve?" "Yes," I said. "I have for 9 years." The lamb was getting cold. The champagne my mother had mentioned on the phone was presumably chilling somewhere in the kitchen, waiting for midnight. Outside, Greenwich was quiet, the way it is on New Year's Eve before the hour arrives. "You need to call your attorney," I said to my father. "Not Howard, your own attorney. You need to do that tonight." He looked at me. His face had settled into something I had not seen on it before. Not anger, not the controlled authority he had deployed at country club edges and dining room tables my entire life. Something that looked, stripped of everything else, like a man who has driven a long way and arrived somewhere he did not intend to be. I gathered my copies of the document. I put them back in my bag. I stood up from the table. I thanked my mother for the lamb. I told Kelsey it was nice to see her. I picked up my coat from the chair where I had placed it when I arrived, because I had known, when I arrived, that I would not be staying long. I walked to the door. I opened it myself. The cold came in. Clean, specific, the cold of a Connecticut winter night that does not negotiate. I did not look back. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York occupies a building on Liberty Street in Lower Manhattan that most people walk past without looking up. It is worth looking up. The building is limestone and sandstone, 14 stories, built in the style of a Florentine Renaissance palace, which is to say it was designed to communicate, without ambiguity, that the institution inside it is permanent and serious and not subject to the pressures that bend ordinary structures. I had walked through its entrance hundreds of times. I had never once taken it for granted. January 7th was a Tuesday. Cold, clear, the kind of morning that makes Manhattan look like a city that has been cleaned overnight. I arrived at 7:40, 2 hours before the proceeding was scheduled to begin. I went to my office, I made coffee. I reviewed my notes, not because I needed to. I had reviewed them the previous 4 evenings, and knew the material the way you know something, when you have lived inside it for months. But because the act of reviewing settled something in me, organized the room of it, put everything in its correct place before the door opened, Sandra had called the previous evening. She told me the subpoenas had been received and acknowledged. All named parties had confirmed attendance through their attorneys. My parents had retained a criminal defense attorney from a firm in Hartford, a man named Stephen Alcott who had a reputation for methodical, careful work. Howard Briggs had retained separate counsel. The Harwick employee who had processed the fraudulent amendment, a trust administration officer named Dale Fenton, had retained counsel as well, and had, Sandra told me quietly, already begun preliminary conversations about cooperation. "Is that good?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. For the case, she said yes. For the picture it paints, yes. I asked if there was anything I needed to do differently in the morning. "Just be yourself," she said. "You're not a witness in this proceeding, Naomi. You're the examiner of record. You sit at the examiner's table, and you present your findings the way you would present any examination findings. That's all, I said. At 8:30, I took the elevator to the fourth floor, where the hearing room was located. It was a formal space, long table at the front for the examining panel, rows of chairs for parties and their counsel, a recording system, a projector screen. I had been in this room for two prior matters, both of them significantly less personal. Curtis and Vera were already there. Curtis had the document binders arranged in the order we had agreed on. Vera had the projection materials set up. They both looked at me when I came in with the careful attention of people who understand the weight of what they are part of and want to carry their portion correctly. Good? Curtis said. Good, I said. The parties began arriving at 8:50. Howard Briggs came first, with his attorney, a younger man who carried himself with the particular alertness of someone who has been briefed thoroughly and is hoping the briefing was sufficient. Howard sat in the third row. He did not look at me when he came in. He had not looked directly at me since New Year's Eve, when he had closed the manila folder and not opened it again. Dale Fenton arrived with his attorney at 8:55. He was a slight man in his early 60s with the look of someone who had spent decades in the back offices of financial institutions, careful, precise, accustomed to invisibility. He sat in the second row. He did look at me, briefly, when he came in. The look was not hostile. It was the look of a man who has made a decision he cannot undo, and is now simply present for what follows. Brandon arrived at 8:58, alone. He had not been subpoenaed. He was not formally a party to the proceeding, but Sandra had included him on the notification list, given that funds traceable to the trust had been used for his benefit. His attorney had advised him to attend. He sat in the back row, in a coat I recognized as one my parents had given him 2 Christmases ago. He looked younger than 34. He looked, for the first time I could remember, uncertain. My parents arrived at 9:02, which was 2 minutes late, which I suspected was intentional. A small assertion of control over the timing of their own arrival. They came in together. My father in a dark suit, my mother in gray, both of them with the composed, forward-facing posture of people who have decided to meet a situation with dignity, regardless of what the situation is. They walked in side by side. My father's eyes found the room first, scanning it the way he always scanned rooms. Assessing the architecture of power, locating the relevant parties, calculating. He found the examining table. He found Curtis and Vera. He found the projection screen, which was still dark. Then he found me. I was seated at the center of the examining table, my credentials case in front of me, my document binders aligned to my left. I was in the black blazer. I had worn it to every examination for 9 years, and I wore it now for the same reason I always wore it. Not for appearance, but because it was the garment I associated with the work, and this was the work. My father stopped walking. It was not a dramatic stop. He did not stumble, did not make a sound. He simply stopped for one step before continuing to his seat. My mother, half a step behind him, looked up when he stopped. She looked at the examining table. She looked at me. Her face did not change. My mother's face almost never changed in public, but her hand, which had been at her side, moved to my father's arm, not reaching for him, steadying herself. The gesture was small and involuntary, and I do not think she knew she made it. They sat in the first row, directly in front of the table. Stephen Alcott, their attorney, sat beside my father and opened a leather portfolio. The senior attorney from Sandra's office, a man named James Whitfield, who was leading the proceeding, called the room to order at 9:05. He reviewed the procedural framework. This was a formal examination hearing under federal authority. The record would be maintained. All parties had been provided the relevant documentation in advance, and the findings of the Federal Reserve examination of Harwick Private Bank would be presented by the examiner of record. He said my name. He said my title. He said the case number. Ms. Turner, he said, please proceed. I opened the first binder. I had presented examination findings many times. The structure is always the same. Establish the institution, establish the examination scope, establish the methodology, present the findings in sequence from general to specific, support each finding with the documentary record. It is not a performance, it is a construction. You build it piece by piece, and when it is complete, it stands on its own. I began with Harwick's general profile. Asset size, client demographics, fiduciary book scope. I presented the preliminary review that had identified the anomaly in the reported decrease of discretionary trust accounts. I presented the document request and the materials received on day 1. I put account number HT2060-0394 on the screen. I heard in the front row the faint sound of a leather portfolio opening, Alcott writing something. My mother I did not look at. My father I did not look at. I looked at the screen and at my binder and at James Whitfield. And at the record I was building in real time, I presented the original trust instrument. Gerald T. Whitmore, October 14, 2016. Clean, valid. Specific in its terms, I presented the amendment, March 3, 2017. I presented the notary's sworn statement that the stamp had been copied without her knowledge and the signature was not hers. I presented the forensic document analysis obtained through the U.S. Attorney's Office, confirming that the signature purporting to be Gerald T. Whitmore's on the amendment document was inconsistent with known exemplars of his signatures and had been produced by a different hand. I presented the transaction history. 41 withdrawals, 7 years, $887,400. I put each category on the screen, the dates, the amounts, the authorization signatures. I put the $340,000 property transaction on the screen, with the address of the Upper West Side apartment. In the back row, I heard Brandon make a sound. Not words, just a sound brief and low, the sound of a number landing. I presented the internal Harwick correspondence, the emails between the Trust Administration Department and Howard Briggs's office in which the irregularities of the amendment had been discussed and processed regardless. I presented Dale Fenton's preliminary cooperation statement, which had been redacted for the proceeding, but confirmed the essential facts. The room was very quiet throughout. The kind of quiet that is not passive. It is the quiet of a room full of people paying close attention because they understand that what is being said cannot be unsaid, and the record being built cannot be unbuilt. I presented the final summary. The total value of the trust at establishment, $2.4 million. The total withdrawn against a fraudulent instrument, $880,400. The current account balance, which reflected 7 years of management fees charged against the depleted principal, $1,341,200. The difference between what should have been there and what was, more than $1 million. I closed the final binder. The examination record is complete, I said. All supporting documentation has been transmitted to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York and is incorporated by reference into this proceeding. James Whitfield thanked me. He turned to address the parties and their counsel regarding next steps. I looked up then, for the first time since I had begun, at the front row. My father was looking at the table in front of him. Not at me, not at the screen, which had gone dark, at the surface of the table as though something on it required his full attention. His hands were flat on his knees. His face had the quality I had seen briefly on New Year's Eve, the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not intend to be, and now understands he will not be leaving the same way he came. My mother was looking at me, not with anger. I had prepared myself for anger, had thought about what anger from her would look like in this room, and how I would receive it. This was not anger. It was something I did not have a precise word for, a look that contained, in proportion I could not measure, recognition, and something that might have been grief, and something that might have been a question she would not ask in this room or possibly ever. I held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then I looked back at my binder and closed it. Outside, through the high windows of the hearing room, Manhattan continued. Traffic on Liberty Street, someone's coffee getting cold on someone's desk. The ordinary motion of an ordinary Tuesday in January, indifferent and continuous, the way the world is when something that has taken years to arrive finally does. The proceeding formally concluded at 11:40. James Whitfield thanked the parties, noted the record was closed, and indicated that the U.S. Attorney's Office would be in contact with all named parties and their counsel regarding next steps. He said it in the measured, neutral tone of someone who has delivered this sentence many times and understands that its meaning lands differently depending on which side of the table you are sitting on. For the parties in the front row, next steps meant something specific. Stephen Alcott leaned toward my father immediately after Whitfield finished speaking. He spoke quietly, close, the way defense attorneys speak to clients when they are managing the immediate aftermath of something that has gone badly. My father nodded, once. His hands were still flat on his knees. He had not moved them throughout the entire proceeding, 2 hours and 35 minutes, and he had sat with his hands flat on his knees, like a man who understood that any other configuration of his body might communicate something he could not afford to communicate. My mother had not looked at me again. after that first exchange of eyes. She sat straight. She did not cry. Whatever she was doing internally, in those 2 hours and 35 minutes, she did it without visible evidence, which was, I thought, the most my mother thing she could possibly have done in those circumstances. Howard Briggs left first. He and his attorney were through the door within 90 seconds of Whitfield's closing remarks. Howard did not look at me. He had not looked at me once during the proceeding. I did not require him to. Brandon stood when Briggs left. He stood and he looked at the back of my parents' heads, and then he looked at me, and his face had a quality I had not seen on it in 32 years of knowing him. Not the easy confidence, not the mild amusement, not the comfortable assumption that things would resolve in his favor, because they generally had. He looked stripped. The word that came to me, watching him, was stripped, like a room that has been emptied of its furniture, and is suddenly just walls and floor, and the dimensions you never noticed when the furniture was there. He opened his mouth. I thought he was going to say something. He did not say anything. He closed his mouth and he walked out. I watched him go. I thought about the $340,000. I thought about the ceiling height. I thought about him standing in my apartment hallway saying at the end of the day, we look out for each other. I thought about the fact that he had sat in the back row of this room for 2.5 hours and heard in sequential documented order the mechanism by which his apartment had been purchased and had not once interjected, objected, or left. I do not know what he knew before today. I have thought about that question, and I do not have a clean answer, and I have decided that it is not mine to resolve. That question belongs to him. Dale Fenton left with his attorney without incident. His cooperation would matter in what came next. I did not look at him with gratitude or resentment. He had made a calculation and acted on it, which is what people do. My parents remained seated after everyone else had left. Alcott was still beside my father, speaking quietly. A paralegal from Sandra's office has gathering materials at the front of the room. Curtis and Vera were packing the document binders. The room had the particular atmosphere of a place that has held something significant and is now simply a room again. I was closing my bag when I heard the door open. Sandra Cho came in with 2 colleagues. Not from her office. Federal agents. I had known they were coming. I had known since the previous week, when Sandra had told me that given the weight of the evidentiary record and the risk of asset dissipation, her office had determined that custodial action would follow the proceeding directly. I had not told anyone else. The agents crossed the room. One of them addressed my father by name. He presented credentials. He stated in the formal language that those moments require that Richard Allen Turner was being placed under arrest on federal charges, including wire fraud, bank fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse. The last charge applying to the fraudulent use of a deceased individual's identity in a fiduciary instrument. My father stood. He stood the way he had always stood. Straight, controlled, the posture of a man who has spent his life in rooms where posture communicates authority. He looked at the agent. He looked at Alcott. He did not look at me. They placed handcuffs on him at 9 minutes past noon. My mother made a sound when the cuffs went on. Not a word. A sound, short, involuntary, the kind of sound that bypasses every learned response and comes from somewhere older and more immediate. She rose from her chair. Alcott put a hand on her arm. She did not push it away, but she also did not sit back down. She stood beside her chair with her hand at her mouth, and she watched them walk my father toward the door. At the threshold he turned his head. I do not know what he was looking for. The room, his wife, some last thing he could take with him. His eyes passed over me. I do not know if he registered me in that moment, truly registered me, or if I was simply part of the room he was leaving. His expression had not changed. It was the same expression, the man who had arrived somewhere he did not intend to be. Then he was through the door. The second agent turned to my mother. He addressed her by name. He stated the charges, identical to my father's, with the addition of filing a fraudulent, notarized instrument. He stated that she was under arrest. My mother lowered her hand from her mouth. She looked at the agent with an expression I had seen only once before. At my grandfather's funeral, when the casket was being carried out, and she had watched it go with an expression spune that was beyond grief, beyond performance, something raw and unguarded that she had not known she was showing. She looked at the agent with that expression now. She did not resist. She did not speak. She extended her wrists. They took her out. The room was very quiet after that. Curtis and Vera had stopped moving. The paralegal from Sandra's office was very still. Outside in the corridor, I could hear the ordinary sounds of the building: footsteps, a phone ringing somewhere, the low mechanical hum of a large structure going about its day. I stood at the examining table with my bag over my shoulder and my credentials case in my hand, and I looked at the two empty chairs in the front row. They were ordinary chairs. Dark upholstery, standard issue, the kind of chair that exists in conference rooms and hearing rooms across the country. In buildings where consequential things happen and unremarkable things happen, and no distinction is made between them by the furniture. My parents had sat in those chairs for 2.5 hours. Now they were empty. I thought about Field Point Road, the circular driveway, Paul coming on Thursdays, the smell of the house at Christmas. My grandfather at my graduation in a blue linen jacket, clapping when they called my name. I thought about a lot of things, standing there, in the space of approximately 45 seconds. Then Sandra appeared in the doorway. She looked at me across the empty room with the expressions of someone who has done something difficult and done it correctly, and is allowing herself, just briefly, to acknowledge that. "It's done," she said. "Yes," I said. "How are you?" I considered the question the way I considered most questions, actually rather than reflexively. "I'm all right," I said. "I think I'm all right," she nodded. "There's still a long road. Arraignment, trial, or plea. It'll take time, I know," I said. "I've worked federal cases before." She almost smiled. "Right," she said. "You have." I picked up the last binder. I put it under my arm. I walked to the door, and Sandra stepped aside, and I walked out into the corridor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, on a Tuesday in January, 42 floors, above Liberty Street. And I did not feel triumphant, and I did not feel destroyed, and I did not feel the particular empty flatness that sometimes follows long effort. I felt clear. The way a balance sheet feels when every entry is correct and the totals at the bottom cannot be argued with. I took the elevator down. I walked through the entrance I had walked through hundreds of times. I went outside into the cold. The arraignment hearing for both my parents was scheduled for the following Thursday. Brandon received a civil asset recovery notice that same afternoon. The apartment on the Upper West Side was subject to forfeiture proceedings, as proceeds traceable to the fraud. His attorney would advise him on next steps. I do not know what those conversations sounded like. I was not there for them. Howard Briggs surrendered his law license 3 weeks later, before the Bar Association could move to revoke it. Dale Fenton's cooperation agreement was finalized in February. The Harwick employee, who had approved the fraudulent amendment without flagging it, a woman in trust administration, who had been at the bank for 22 years, resigned and received a civil penalty. Harwick Private Bank itself survived the examination, but with a formal enforcement action, a mandated overhaul of its fiduciary oversight procedures, and a consent order that would keep it under elevated Fed supervision for 3 years. Gerald Fitch, the compliance officer, retained his position on the condition of completing a comprehensive remediation program. He sent me a letter in March that I read once and filed. My parents were arraigned on January 14th. They pled not guilty. They would not remain not guilty. The plea agreements came in April. My father first, then my mother, 2 days apart. My father, 4 years in federal prison, restitution of $887,400 plus interest and penalties, forfeiture of the Nantucket property. My mother, 3 years supervised release, substantial fines, community service, a permanent bar from serving as a trustee or fiduciary in any legal capacity. I was not in the courtroom for either plea. Sandra had asked if I wanted to be. I told her I did not need to be. I had already been in the room that mattered. 18 months is long enough for a life to reorganize itself. Not rebuild, reorganize. Rebuild implies that something was destroyed and must be constructed from the beginning, which suggests the original structure was worth replicating. What I had before January 7th was not a structure I wanted to replicate. What I had was the bones of one. The work, the discipline, the particular clarity that comes from understanding numbers and what they mean. Surrounded by a family arrangement that had been quietly consuming resources, mine and otherwise, for as long as I could remember, what I have now is different. Simpler, in the ways that matter. The trust was restored in full through the legal process. The $887,400 in fraudulent withdrawals was returned, ordered as restitution and drawn from my parents' assets before sentencing. The interest penalties added another $214,000. Legal fees and court costs came off that, and what remained, combined with the original principal and 7 years of actual growth on the portion that had not been withdrawn, came to $3.1 million, transferred to a new account at an institution I selected with myself as the sole trustee. I looked at the balance on the day the transfer confirmed. I looked at it for a long time, not with the feeling I might have expected, not relief, not triumph, not the satisfaction of something recovered, something quieter. The recognition that a number on a screen represented years of my grandfather's work, years of a deliberate choice he had made about who in his family he trusted with what he had built, and that the number was finally where he had intended it to be. I thought about what he had said at dinner after my graduation. "You're going to be the one, Naomi." I understood now that he had meant it more specifically than I had known. He had watched his family carefully, as careful men do, and he had made his decision, and the only miscalculation he had made was in believing that the institution holding his decision was stronger than the people determined to subvert it. He had not anticipated the combination of factors that ultimately protected it. A federal auditor with statutory authority, a U.S. attorney who moved quickly, and the particular providence of a bank examination schedule that put the right name on the right assignment at the right time. Or perhaps, and I think about this sometimes, in the way you think about things that cannot be confirmed but feel true, he had anticipated something. Not the specifics, but the direction. Perhaps he had seen, in me at 26, the kind of person who would find a way. I bought a house in March. Not in Greenwich. I had considered Greenwich and decided against it, not from bitterness but from accuracy. Greenwich was not my place. It was a place I had grown up adjacent to, and there is a difference. What I found was a house in Westport, not far, but distinct. A 1940s colonial on a quiet street with a yard that needed work and windows that let in more light than I had ever had in any apartment. I paid for it directly, no mortgage. I did not celebrate this fact, but I noted it. I kept my job. I want to be clear about that because people ask. People assume sometimes that the case had complicated my position at the Fed, given the dual nature of my role. It had not. Every disclosure had been made correctly, every protocol followed. My supervisor had reviewed the matter twice and found no procedural violations. The examination of Harwick had, if anything, enhanced the division's record. A complex fraud identified, a federal prosecution initiated, enforcement action completed, and an institutional remediation underway. My annual review in February was the strongest I had received. I still carry my credentials case in the left inside pocket of my bag. I still wear the black blazer to examinations. I still arrive early and review my notes on the morning of a proceeding. Not because I need to, but because the habit is the habit and the habit is part of what I am. My Aunt Carol called in February, 3 weeks after the plea agreements. She was careful on the phone, careful in the way of someone who has watched something collapse and is trying to locate the appropriate emotional register for the aftermath. She said she was sorry. She said she had not known. I told her I believed her. She asked if I would come to a family gathering in the spring. Her daughter's birthday, something small. I said I would think about it. I have not thought about it yet, which is itself a kind of answer. Brandon I have not spoken to since the January proceeding. The apartment forfeiture was completed in March. He is renting a 2-bedroom in Hoboken and working, according to what I have been told secondhand, in commercial real estate, a field he had considered years ago. When my father mentioned it at a Christmas dinner as though it were his own idea. I do not wish him harm. I do not, if I am honest, wish him much of anything. He occupies a space in my thinking that has no strong emotion attached to it, which is perhaps the most accurate accounting of what our relationship always was beneath its surface. My father began his federal sentence in June. My mother's supervised release began the same month. I do not know the details of their daily lives now. I have not sought them out. Sandra told me when I asked once that restitution payments were being made on schedule. That is all I needed to know. What I know, which is separate from what I track. I know that there are Sunday mornings now, when I sit in the kitchen of the Westport house with coffee and the yard visible through the window, the grass growing in where I have been working on it, the oak tree at the back that must be 80 years old, the light coming in at the angle it comes in at that hour, and I feel something that I did not have a precise name for at first. I have settled on calling it spaciousness. The feeling of a life that has been cleared of a weight that had been there so long it had become invisible, and now that it is gone, the dimensions of everything are different, larger, more accurately themselves. I am 33 years old. I have a house with a yard and an oak tree. I have a job I am good at, and that matters. I have $3.1 million in a trust account with my name on it and my name only. I have a legal pad on my kitchen table with 2 columns: what I know, what I suspect, and for the first time in as long as I can remember, the right column is nearly empty. My grandfather left me something he believed in. It took longer than it should have to arrive, but it arrived. There is something I want to say to anyone watching this who has been in a family where the rules were different for you than for someone else. Where you were the one who was managed, explained, preemptively discredited before you could speak. Where the people who were supposed to protect your interests were the same ones quietly dismantling them. I want to say this. The truth does not require your anger to exist. It does not require you to perform your pain for an audience, or to convince anyone in advance, or to fight your way into a room where you can finally be heard. The truth requires only that you do your work, that you keep the record, that you understand the difference between what you know and what you suspect, and that you do not allow the one to become the other before the evidence is ready. Dignity is not what they give you. It is not conferred at dining room tables, or in country club ballrooms, or in documents prepared by attorneys with manila folders. It is what you carry into the room yourself. It was in you before anyone decided it wasn't. It will be in you long after. Do not sign anything you have not read. Do not let urgency be used as a substitute for clarity. And do not, ever, mistake silence for weakness. Sometimes silence is simply the patience of someone who already knows exactly how this ends. If this story stayed with you, I want to hear from you in the comments. Tell me what you carried into a room that nobody expected you to be carrying. Tell me about the moment someone underestimated you and paid for it in ways they never anticipated. I read every comment. I want to know. And if you are new here, if this is the first story of mine you have found, subscribe. There are more. There are always more.